At its peak, the Anglo-French Concorde represented the height of technological achievement and sleek design in 20th century aviation. Long regarded as the most beautiful commercial airliner the world had seen, it was the West's first supersonic passenger jet and the fastest of its era. But Concorde was not the very first supersonic airliner to reach the market. That distinction belongs to a Soviet aircraft that exceeded the speed of sound months before Concorde and for a time became a source of national pride before ultimately failing. The communist counterpart to Concorde was the Tupolev Tu-144, the first passenger aircraft to fly at more than twice the speed of sound. Tupolev's first flight occurred 3 months before Concorde's maiden flight on March 2, 1969, but the Tu-144, dubbed Concorde ski by Western observers because of its similarities to the Western rival, ever achieved the same popularity. It is perhaps best known as the first commercial supersonic airliner to suffer a crash landing. An ignominious destiny it met twice. Just like many Cold War technological feats, the supersonic race was driven by political rivalry. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev learned in 1960 about a new supersonic project in Britain and France. Concorde was envisaged as a passenger plane that could fly supersonically and cut transatlantic travel time to only a few hours. Military fighters, such as the Soviet MiG-21 and the US F-104, already exceeded twice the speed of sound. So commercial supersonic travel, while daunting, seemed achievable. Khrushchev immediately demanded a Soviet equivalent one that would be faster than Concorde and completed first. The desire to beat the West trumped many procedural concerns about safety and craftsmanship. As one former Concorde pilot observed, the space race and the competition to put a man on the moon were happening simultaneously. Soviet successes in the early 1960s had emboldened leaders to take on ever more ambitious projects, and expectations for Soviet scientific and technological achievement were enormous. The Tu-144 project simply had to succeed. The Soviet focus on long-range rockets and high-altitude missiles after early space victories meant the Tu-144. It had to be developed as a separate civil aircraft program. Soviet engineers faced added pressure. The supersonic plane also had to offer passenger comfort and be economically viable requirements unfamiliar to the Soviet aviation industry. The Tu-144 was unquestionably larger than Concorde, stretching over 215 feet in length, almost 12 feet longer than its Western rival. It could cruise at just over Mach 2, about 1,340 miles per hour, and each of its 4 engines could generate more than 44,000 pounds of thrust. Concorde, with slightly more thrust per engine, could achieve higher performance. However, several technical problems dogged the Tu-144's development, including issues with brakes and engine control systems. For example, the brakes couldn't withstand the enormous heat generated during high-speed landings. Being more powerful and heavier meant the Tu-144 needed more lift and power to take off. And part of its weight problem came from an enormous undercarriage. It required no fewer than 12 wheels under its wings, in part because Soviet tires were made of synthetic rubber and were more fit. The Soviets tried to mitigate these issues with a distinctive pair of small winglets, or canards, just behind the cockpit. These provided extra lift and improved low-speed handling. The Tu-144 first flew in December 1968 and reached supersonic speed in June 1969. Concorde didn't fly until March 1969 and did not go supersonic until October 1969, when the Soviets displayed 2 Tu-144s. At the Paris Air Show in 1971, the reaction was enthusiastic. French President Georges Pompidou called it a beautiful plane, and even the makers of Concorde conceded that the Soviet supersonic design seemed quieter and cleaner. Ilya, a Soviet aviation expert and engineering professor, said expectations were high and the entire USSR was extremely proud. The Soviet public had no doubt it was superior to Concorde and admired its looks. Some Western observers suspected foul play, claiming the only way the Soviet Union could have produced the Tu-144 was through industrial espionage. The Tu-144 was patronizingly nicknamed Concordeski, to imply it was a crude copy of Concorde. While the Tu-144 was indeed heavily influenced by Concorde, its engine configuration and many design details were different. The Tu-144 needed to be more rugged to cope with tougher operating conditions in the Soviet Union. It may have resembled Concorde, but it differed substantially in refinement and execution. At the 1973 Paris Air Show, the Soviets planned to unveil an updated Tu-144 on June 3, 1973, putting it on display alongside a Concorde prototype. At that time, Concorde had still not entered production. Tu-144 test pilot Mikhail Kozlov reportedly taunted the Concorde team, saying, "Just wait until you see us fly, then you'll see something." The Soviet crew intended to outdo Concorde's more cautious flying display from the previous day. The specific aircraft involved was Tupolev Tu-144, SSSSEP-77172. Manufacturer's serial number 01. That aircraft first flew on March 29, 1972. It had been significantly modified. The engine housings, or nacelles, were split on either side of the fuselage, so the landing gear retracted into them. And it had retractable. The Tu-144 had taken off from Le Bourget Airport and approached the runway as if to land. Nose lowered and undercarriage down. The landing gear was out and the canards clearly extended. But something was wrong. The crowd watched in amazement as the plane suddenly and rapidly climbed with all four engines at full power. Seconds later, tragedy struck. The aircraft likely stalled just under 2,000 feet, pitched over, and went into a steep dive while the pilots fought to pull out with engines still at full power. The Tu-144 broke up in midair, the left wing coming off first, probably due to overstressing of the airframe, then disintegrating further as it plunged into the nearby village of Goussainville, destroying 15 houses. All of this unfolded in front of about 250,000 spectators, including the aircraft's famed designer, Alexei Tupolev. There were several theories about why the Tu-144 crashed. One suggested the pilot had maneuvered too aggressively at low speed, causing a loss of lift and a stall. Another argued that intense rivalry with the Anglo-French Concorde drove Soviet pilots to attempt a maneuver beyond the aircraft's limits. Bob Hoover, a pilot on America's Bell X-1 program, believed that competitive pressure led the Tu-144 pilot to try a dangerous move. Ilya Grinberg later said, Soviet pilots tried to impress the public and press to show their plane could be flashier than Concorde's more conservative display, something evident in the footage. Other rumors: cloudy conditions confusing the crew, an evasive action to avoid a French Mirage fighter photographing the or deliberate sabotage via flawed blueprints from Concorde's makers have been floated but mostly disproven or remain unproven. The crash exposed many problems in the Tu-144's pioneering design, and Tupolev's team had to address a long list of issues before the aircraft could be approved for service with Aero. It was only in 1977 that the Tu-144 began carrying passengers. In service, it proved unpopular. Cabins were cramped, ceiling panels came loose, service trays jammed, and window shades dropped on their own. Engines and air conditioning units made enormous noise, and the plane required loud afterburners to sustain supersonic cruise. Passengers described an ear-shattering roar that made conversation impossible and said they could only communicate by passing notes. Technical problems ranged from sudden depressurization to engine failures and persistent alarms that could not be silenced. So frequently did things need checking that every flight out of Moscow required a personal inspection by the plane's designer. Alexei Tupolev, Aeroflot, used the Tu-144 on a short, obscure route between Moscow and Almaty, now Almaty, chosen because it crossed sparsely populated areas. Weekly flights were mostly half-empty, and the aircraft carried more cargo and mail than passengers. The service lasted just 55 return passenger flights before being cancelled. The program's final blow came on May 23, 1978. When a commercial Tu-144 caught fire near Moscow and made an emergency landing. That accident led to a complete ban on passenger flights of the Tu-144. By then, Soviet leaders had already grown tired of the costly, problematic program. Tu-144. Production officially ended in 1982. Concorde, by contrast, became a relative commercial success for a time, flying thousands of transatlantic trips for Air France and British Airways. Even Concorde eventually met a tragic fate. On July 25, 2000, during takeoff at Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport, debris on the runway ruptured a tire and punctured a fuel tank, and the aircraft caught fire and crashed. In an eerie symmetry, that Concorde accident occurred just 9 miles from where the Tu-144 had crashed in June 1973. Asterisk.